Nasser's triumph reverberated far beyond Egypt's borders, to millions across the Arab world, Africa, and Asia. His defiance became a symbol of a new era, one in which nations emerging from colonial rule could resist the great powers and claim their own future. Crowds across the Middle East celebrated. Newspapers hailed him as the man who had broken the grip of empire. In Cairo, his speeches drew thousands, chanting his name with a fervor unmatched in modern Egyptian history. Though Egypt had endured military losses, the political victory was undeniable. Nasser had not only survived the combined assault of three nations, he had forced them to retreat. In the age of empires, this would have been unthinkable, but the Suez Crisis had made one thing unmistakably clear. The old rules no longer applied. Britain, in particular, suffered a humiliating collapse of prestige. Once the master of a global empire, it now found itself forced to abandon military operations, not by battlefield defeat, but by financial pressure from its supposed ally, the United States. The pound was collapsing. Washington threatened to withhold critical IMF support unless Britain withdrew immediately. It was a brutal reminder that power had shifted across the Atlantic, that the era of London shaping world events was over, and that American approval was now essential for any major Western action. Within 2 months, Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned from office, his career irreparably broken by the disastrous intervention. France also emerged weakened. Its leaders had hoped that defeating Nasser would cripple his support for Algerian independence. Instead, the opposite happened. Nasser's survival emboldened anti-colonial movements across North Africa. In Algeria, rebels of the National Liberation Front hailed the Egyptian leader as a hero and saw his victory as proof that the French Empire was vulnerable. The war in Algeria would drag on for 6 more brutal years, but the Suez debacle had already planted the seeds of France, its eventual withdrawal and the collapse of its colonial presence in Africa. Israel, meanwhile, had scored a swift and decisive military victory in the Sinai but found itself under intense pressure to relinquish its gains. Washington demanded withdrawal, insisting that Israel return the captured territory in exchange for international guarantees, including United Nations peacekeepers and renewed access to the Straits of Tiran. Though Israel achieved temporary security and affirmed its military strength, it had also learned that its actions would always be shaped by the broader Cold War politics surrounding it. For Egypt, the consequences were profound. Though its military had been outmatched on the battlefield, its political victory transformed the country. Soviet support poured in. The USSR funded the Aswan High Dam after the West had refused. Soviet engineers, diplomats, and weapons soon became central to Egypt's modernization. Moscow viewed Nasser as the rising star of Arab nationalism and a vital counterweight to American influence. The Cold War map of the Middle East was being redrawn, and Egypt was shifting rapidly into the Soviet orbit. The United States faced a complicated reality. Eisenhower despised colonialism and wanted to prevent European powers from dragging the world into another global conflict. But by opposing Britain, France, and Israel, he had also angered key allies. Still, Washington believed it had protected long-term interests by preventing a colonial-style war and maintaining credibility with newly independent nations across Asia and Africa. The U.S. saw itself as the leader of the free world, and its firm stance against the invasion became a foundational moment in its strategy to win hearts and minds in the developing world. Soviet leaders, meanwhile, capitalized on the crisis. Khrushchev used the moment to portray the USSR as the defender of anti-colonial movements, contrasting Soviet support for Egypt with Western interference. Soviet propaganda celebrated Nasser as a hero of global revolution, strengthening ties with Arab nations. But the crisis also revealed something more ominous. At the very same moment Soviet tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising, Moscow was presenting itself as the guardian of national freedom. The contradiction was stark, but in the battle for global influence, perception mattered more than consistency. At the center of it all was the Suez Canal itself. Its closure for months after the conflict disrupted global trade and forced European nations to reroute oil shipments around the Cape of Good Hope, dramatically increasing costs. Western Europe realized just how vulnerable it was to disruptions in Middle Eastern transit routes, sparking long-term strategic shifts in energy policy. The canal would eventually reopen under Egyptian control, but the message was clear. Global commerce had entered a new era in which political instability, not imperial protection, shaped the world's most important waterways. The crisis also accelerated the wave of decolonization sweeping across the globe. If Britain and France, once the most powerful empires in history, could not enforce their will in Egypt, how could they hold on to vast territories in Africa and Asia? Within a decade, dozens of nations would claim independence. The illusion of European supremacy had been shattered. In the Middle East, Nasser's victory unleashed a surge of Arab nationalism that reshaped regional politics. He became the central figure of a movement that sought to unite Arab nations under one political identity. Free from Western influence, his charisma and defiance inspired millions, but it also threatened traditional monarchies and Western-backed governments. Across the region, the balance of power was shifting, and not everyone welcomed it. For Israel, the long-term consequences were equally significant. Although it gained temporary security assurances, it also witnessed how fragile regional alignments were. The next decade would see rising tensions that eventually exploded into the Six-Day War of 1967, in which the unresolved issues from the Suez Crisis would play a critical role. In Britain, the crisis forced a deep reckoning. The public realized that the country could no longer act independently on the world stage. The humiliation strengthened Britain's resolve to forge a closer relationship with the United States, and eventually accelerated its push toward European integration. Many historians consider the Suez Crisis the moment when Britain finally accepted that its empire was finished. The crisis also reshaped France's foreign policy. Feeling betrayed by the United States, France began pursuing a more independent military and diplomatic strategy. This shift influenced Charles de Gaulle's return to power in 1958 and eventually led France to withdraw from NATO's integrated command structure. The Suez Crisis had not only fractured the old imperial order, it altered the Western alliance itself. For Egypt, the aftermath was a mixture of triumph and challenge. Nasser's popularity skyrocketed, but so did expectations. He became the face of Arab unity, hosting conferences, leading political movements, and articulating a new vision for the Middle East. Yet the pressures of leadership, the complexities of regional politics, and the growing entanglement with the Soviet Union would present new challenges. The hope and ambition generated by the crisis would collide with the harsh realities of international power in the years ahead. But in 1956, none of that was yet visible. What the world saw was a small nation standing firm against three powerful adversaries and emerging with its sovereignty intact. The Suez Crisis revealed the limits of old empires, the rise of new nations, and the growing dominance of superpower politics. It showed that global influence no longer belonged to those who claimed it by tradition, but to those who could command it with diplomacy, public opinion, and strategic alliances. A canal carved through the desert had exposed the fault lines of the modern world, and in its waters, the last reflections of the imperial age faded, replaced by the turbulent, unpredictable currents of the Cold War era. The Suez Crisis did not just shake the world, it announced that the world had changed forever. The world in 1956 stood on the edge of a new age, one in which old empires were dying, new powers were rising, and a narrow strip of water running through the Egyptian desert would become the fault line of global politics. The Suez Canal, a 100-mile artery connecting Europe to the riches of Asia, had long been controlled by the great imperial powers. But by mid-century, the age of empire was collapsing, and for one young, defiant Egyptian leader, the canal symbolized something far greater than trade. It was dignity, independence, and the right of a nation to govern its own destiny. When Gamal Abdel Nasser stunned the world by nationalizing the Suez Canal, he didn't just seize a company. He challenged the old world order, and the response would shake the globe. To understand the crisis that followed, you must first understand the ghosts haunting Britain and France. Their empires had once stretched across continents, projecting authority through culture, wealth, and force. But after the devastation of the Second World War, both nations found themselves exhausted, indebted, and facing independence movements in nearly every corner of their territories. Yet the canal remained their lifeline, especially for Britain. Nearly two-thirds of Western Europe's oil flowed through it. Losing control would mean losing leverage, losing prestige, and losing the last remaining illusion that they were still world powers. For London and Paris, Surrendering the Suez Canal was unthinkable. Egypt, however, saw things very differently. In 1952, the Free Officers movement had overthrown King Farouk, ending the monarchy and British domination over Egyptian affairs. Among these officers was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a charismatic young colonel whose ambition, intelligence, and political instincts made him the natural leader of the revolution. For Egyptians, Nasser's rise was electrifying. Born in modest circumstances, shaped by humiliation under colonial rule, and driven by the dream of Arab sovereignty, he personified the struggle for independence. To him, the canal was not just infrastructure. It was national pride carved into the desert. Britain still maintained a military presence in the Suez Canal zone, a remnant of its once dominant role in the region. But nationalist pressure was mounting. In 1954, the British finally agreed to withdraw their remaining troops, though they retained the right to return if the canal was threatened. To London, this compromise maintained influence. To Nasser, it was only the first step toward full sovereignty. Nasser wanted to modernize Egypt, strengthen its military, and transform its economy. The key to all of this was the massive Aswan High Dam project on the Nile, which would generate hydroelectric power and revolutionize agriculture. But Egypt needed money, hundreds of millions of dollars. The most powerful financial institution in the world, the US-backed World Bank, seemed like the only path forward. At first, Washington was willing to help. The United States wanted Egypt on its side in the Cold War, hoping to prevent Soviet influence from spreading across the Arab world. But Nasser was no one's puppet. He refused to join Western military alliances, insisted on supporting Arab independence movements, and purchased weapons from Czechoslovakia, a Soviet ally. This decision infuriated the Eisenhower administration. And so, in July 1956, the United States abruptly withdrew its offer to fund the Aswan Dam. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and deeply personal. Nasser was furious, and he needed a response that would demonstrate that Egypt could not be bullied. On 26 July 1956, standing before a massive crowd in Alexandria, he announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. The moment was electrifying. The crowd erupted. In the West, the reaction was shock and panic. Britain and France saw the move, not just as a threat to their economies, but as an unforgivable challenge to their authority. Nasser had seized their asset, humiliated them before the world, and shown that colonial dominance was crumbling. To regain prestige, they believed he had to be removed. But there was another country watching closely. Israel. For years, it had faced raids along its borders, been blocked from using the Straits of Tiran, and seen Egyptian-backed forces mobilizing against it. Nasser's boldness, his arms deal with the Soviets, and his rising influence across the Arab world made him Israel's most dangerous enemy. The interests of Israel, Britain, and France suddenly aligned. Behind closed doors, the three nations began crafting a secret plan. They met in a villa in Suez, outside Paris, with no cameras, no reporters, and no official records. What emerged would become one of the most controversial conspiracies of the Cold War. Israel would invade Egypt first, advancing toward the Suez Canal. Then Britain and France would issue an ultimatum demanding that both sides withdraw from the canal zone, an ultimatum crafted so Egypt could never accept it. When Nasser refused, Britain and France would intervene militarily, claiming they were acting as peacekeepers, but in reality, intending to topple him and retake control of the canal. It was a plan built on deception, arrogance, and the assumption that the world would accept their narrative. But the world had changed. The age of empire was over, even if London and Paris had not yet realized it. On the 29th of October 1956, Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Sinai Peninsula, initiating the opening phase of the conspiracy. Their armored forces swept across the desert with overwhelming speed, routing Egyptian troops and advancing rapidly toward the canal. To the outside world, it appeared to be a sudden Israeli offensive. But in reality, everything was unfolding according to the secret Sevres Agreement. When Britain and France issued their ultimatum the next day, it was dismissed immediately by Egypt. That was exactly what London and Paris had anticipated. They now declared that they would use force to separate the combatants and secure the canal zone. But this was 1956, not 1856. And two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, would not allow the old empires to redraw the map. In Washington, President Eisenhower was furious. Britain was America's closest ally. France was part of NATO, and Israel had growing support in Congress. But none of that mattered to Eisenhower. He believed that a colonial-style intervention would destroy America's credibility across the developing world, drive Arab nations into the arms of the Soviets, and potentially trigger a wider conflict. He demanded that the invasion stop. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev issued his own warnings. Despite being occupied with crushing the Hungarian uprising at that very moment, the Kremlin threatened severe consequences if Egypt were attacked further. Khrushchev even hinted at the possibility of rocket strikes on London and Paris, a threat aimed more at intimidation than reality, but one that caused panic in European capitals. Britain and France pressed on, launching airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. Their aircraft inflicted major damage, but not enough to break Egypt's will. Nasser ordered the sinking of ships to block the canal, making it unusable to anyone. Egyptian forces fought fiercely in Port Said and Port Fouad as British and French paratroopers landed along the coast, pushing inward through bitter urban combat. For the first time in decades, imperial armies once feared across the world were facing determined nationalist resistance, and the global audience was watching every moment unfold. As the fighting intensified, the international backlash grew. The United Nations condemned the invasion. US leaders applied financial pressure on Britain so severe that its economy began to buckle within days, threatened with total ruin. The British government realized it had no choice. They had overreached. The age of acting without American approval was gone. Under immense pressure from Washington and global condemnation, Britain and France ordered a ceasefire. Their forces withdrew. Israel, after strong US demands, followed later. Nasser emerged, battered but victorious. A leader of a country that just decades earlier had lived under imperial control had now defied three powerful adversaries and survived. Across the Arab world, his prestige soared to unprecedented heights.